Industry 4.0, Oracle's cloud supply chain capabilities, and why software best practices do not exist. Those are just a few of the topics we'll cover here in episode 261 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you.
3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to episode 261 of Transformation Ground Control. This is the tech-agnostic podcast with no vendor spin that talks about everything related to digital strategy, including people, process, technology, and strategy. So thanks for being here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting company that represents clients' best interest in helping them through their digital transformation journeys. I'm also affiliated with Lander Talent, which handles ERP and IT staffing for organizations going through change. So love to chat with you about your initiatives at some point in the future. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, of course. Excited for another episode.
Yes, this will be a fun one. We're going to go deep into manufacturing today. We're going to talk in the opening segment about some audience questions. We'll answer some audience questions that we've received on social media. We'll get into some newsworthy topics. We'll talk about Oracle expanding its cloud supply chain management capabilities for process manufacturers. IBM is introducing autonomous storage. And then later in the show, we're going to get into Industry 4.0 and manufacturing technology. What's working, what's not, what's next, what are the trends you need to be aware of? So we'll have a deep dive conversation here later in the show. And then last but not least, at the end of the show, our third segment, we'll get into why software best practices do not exist, and they never did. That is meant to be in some advice for buyers of technology. And I fully acknowledge that will also be a trigger for people that sell technology, because that's a core part of their sales messaging is software best practices. So you're welcome, and my apologies depending on which audience you fall into, but we'll get into that later in the show today. But before we jump into today's conversation, what are some of the social media questions we've received here recently, Darian?
Yeah, this first one is, I recommend revisiting a phase 0 analysis and your technical/business roadmap annually. Eric, what do you recommend in terms of how often to revisit your company roadmap?
Yeah, I'd say that's a great point. Even if you're in the midst of a transformation or you're in the middle of a project, I think it's still worth popping your head up and taking a look at where you've come and where you're headed and what's changed since you first started the project. I think it's really important in those cases. But I think just generally speaking, and it's probably a little bit easier to do when you're not in the middle of a formal transformation project or a big transformation project. It's a little bit easier to do. But I'd say an annual review is very relevant, no matter where or what stage you are in your journey, because so much can change, year over year, macroeconomically and with your business. But I'd say, this message or this answer, I think it should be heard even louder and clearer for those that are going through a digital transformation or an ERP or an AI project right now, because that's where you're less likely to take a step back and come up for air and take a look around to see what's changed. In fact, just this week, I was talking to a client of ours. It's one of our bigger clients, and we're about a year and a half into a 2.5-year implementation with that client. And a lot has changed in the client's business in terms of they build components that are used for data center build outs. So their business, they didn't start the business with that intent. They make piping and valves and things of that nature for more industrial manufacturing applications. But with the boom in data centers, they found another use for their products, and it's really caused a pretty significant growth for them in the last couple of years. And we're taking that step back now with this client right now in the middle of conference room pilots. We're looking around saying, hey, hold on, some of these processes that we built earlier in the project are now obsolete already. And so do we want to take the time to get it right now and make sure we are scaling the company for where we are today and where we're headed? Or do we want to stick to the timeline and budget in the name of sticking to the timeline and budget? And unfortunately, most teams have a tendency to put their head down and say, well, I have to hit my milestone. I have to get this done on time, on budget. I'm accountable for this budget. And usually it has to come from the top leadership. And that's what happened here in this case. It was a conversation between the client leadership and myself personally is, what do we do about this? What are we going to do? And what's the trade-off we're willing to make or not to ensure that we at least know where the trade-offs are. So I think it's a really important thing that leaders need to be aware of. Sometimes leaders need to step in and say, look, timeline's important, money's important, resources are important, commitments are important, but not at the expense necessarily of taking us down a path that's just not going to make sense for us long term. And that's just the reality of these projects. It's the reality of running a business. Is sometimes, you didn't know when you started the project what was going to change in your business, but when it does change, you just have to be willing to pivot. And usually that's going to be the faster and cheaper route than trying to force your way through the implementation when it's not a good fit.
Absolutely. Our next question today I found super interesting. This was off of YouTube. It's, what is the value that AI provides today? Why integrate something today based largely on hype when we don't even know what, also if it will be useful until several years from now?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's a valid question. As much as I should be hyping up AI and joining the praises of how awesome AI is, and I do love AI, I think it's cool, but I'm not. I'm talking more using it in our business, which is not the same as every other business out there. It may or may not make sense for you. I think, I think if I were you or if I were an average company, the approach I would take is to take a more measured pilot-based approach. Like, let's try it out in a couple areas of our business where we think there's a lot of potential value, see how it goes, learn from it, let the technology continue to mature, let us get familiar and comfortable with the AI. And then by the time and when AI matures more and it becomes even more scalable, more relevant, and more value add, by then you've already, you've already got some what's it called, some skills and competencies and experience that you can learn from and now scale it across the organization. So I think it's a great question. I think more people should ask the question, why? Like, why are we doing this right now? Technology is cool, but do we really need this? Is it ready for us? Are we ready for it? Those questions don't get asked enough, and we fall too often in this industry. We fall prey to the sales messaging of the technology vendors. So I think that's a really important. Good point.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree there. But I want to get into our first newsworthy article of the day. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. This first one is about how Oracle is expanding their cloud SCM capabilities for process manufacturers. So this article outlines how Oracle is expanding its cloud supply chain management, also SCM, suite to better support process manufacturers industries like chemicals, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, and life sciences. These enhancements are aimed at handling complexity around formulations, compliance, quality, and variable that traditional discrete manufacturing tools often struggle to maintain. According to the article, process manufacturers face fundamentally different challenges than discrete manufacturers, including variable inputs, byproducts, strict regulatory requirements, shelf life constraints, and traceability demands. Oracle's updates focus on areas such as recipe and formula management, quality and compliance tracking, inventory optimization, and tighter integration between supply planning, manufacturing, execution, and financials by embedding these capabilities directly into its SCM platform. Oracle is positioning itself as a more viable option for industries that historically relied heavily on customized or niche ERP systems. The last takeaway I want to mention is Oracle is just signaling a push toward deeper industry specific within its cloud, ERP, and SCM strategy. Rather than relying solely on a broad horizontal functionality, the company is investing in vertical capabilities to win complex, regulated manufacturers that need more generic supply chain tools. So, Eric, with this, first question I have is, how different are the processes, manufacturing requirements from discrete manufacturing and real world ERP implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of differences. I mean, most manufacturing organizations have a lot of variation in their processes, and most of them look different than other manufacturers. And that's by design in most cases. There are exceptions to that where a manufacturer can't justify or explain why they do things the way they do, or it's just the way they've always done it, but there's no really good reason why they've done it that way. But I'd say for the most part, there's a good subset of processes that are varied and different from other competitors that you want it to be that way. I mean, that's what makes you competitive. That's your secret sauce. That's what allows you to win against your customers. And so that's where it gets tricky, moving towards a one size fits all vanilla ERP system. And I think what Oracle is doing is interesting because I think they've always been more of a, I don't want to say best of breed provider, but they've always been more of an industry and a vertical based focused sort of provider. You know, if you go back to the days of Siebel with CRM and JD Edwards with manufacturing and some of these other products that they've acquired, they've actually done really well with that. Also in enterprise performance management and financial consolidations, they've been very strong in that space. So you look at where Oracle is strong, they're not really strong or as strong as like SAP in creating like a true vanilla attempted one size fits all solution. And I think that's probably a good move for Oracle because I think, first of all, the one size fits all ERP model is dying. I think it's dying a slow death. And if I'm Oracle, I'd say let SAP have it. I mean, they already dominate that space. The space might be dying. It's going to probably die off in the future. So let SAP have it, and let's go where the rest of the industry is going, which is more towards, the more focused, the niche-y, the opposite of one size fits all type of offering. And Oracle's always been good at that. So I think it fits their model, it fits their history and their, culture as a company. And it also fits where the industry is headed.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I have with this article is what trade-offs do manufacturers face when choosing a single platform versus a best of breed solution?
Yeah, great question. That's the age-old debate of which is better. I think the technologist in me, if I'm going to take a technology-centric argument here, like an IT-driven argument, I'd say best of breed. The positive the positive of single ERP is that it's one system, one platform for me to manage. Best of breed means I've got multiple systems I've got to maintain. I've got to build integrations. I've got to worry about data flows and whether or not the data is flowing correctly, whether or not I've got a single source of truth with the data. So the IT technologist in me would probably say that single ERP is better. Single ERP is good. Best of breed is bad. If I'm a business user, though, I'm probably going to flip that and say I'd rather have best of breed because then I can get whatever I want. I can get to a fault if I want. I could have 100 different systems in my organization to do every single thing I need done. I can build or find the software that can do exactly that piece of my business exactly the way I want it to work without having to water down any of those processes. Now, again, it's possible to take either of those to an extreme, and I'm over generalizing here, but oftentimes business leaders are more likely to want a best of breed and to go a bit rogue, as far as just go find the technology that they want for their business without consideration for the technical complexities. But the IT people, I think, are more purist in the technological philosophy to a fault to where it can often undermine business operations. So this is where executive leadership becomes so important because ultimately executives have to be the ones to assess those trade-offs because the simplicity of the technology might make life easier for your IT group. It might actually reduce costs for your IT group, but you have to also weigh that against, does that increase my cost on the operational side, or is it worth taking on that additional cost and complexity on the technical side, knowing that it's going to streamline my business operations? And that's a difficult trade-off, but that's where executive leadership and decision-making and clarity needs to come into play.
Absolutely. And last question with this, Eric, how should manufacturers evaluate whether cloud SCM enhancements truly fit their operational reality?
Great question. Well, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you don't have a chance to assess it if you're talking about ongoing changes to the software. Now, of course, if you're just now buying a cloud supply chain solution, then yes, absolutely, you do want to assess and look at your operations and what your future state operating model is going to be or what you want it to be, and assess the product capabilities from that perspective, more of a day in the life of how would that software work with your workflows and your data. It's one thing to get an RFP response that checks all the boxes and, congratulations, 99.9% of your requirements are met by our solution. But it's usually not a yes, no answer, but that's how RFPs and evaluation processes are often built. It's not a checklist driven thing. It's usually not yes or no. Can it do it? I mean, most software can do any function to some degree, but some of it kind of sucks. Yes, it can do it, but it sucks. That's a different answer than yes, it does it really well. And you can't put yes, but it sucks on an RFP, an expense and honest response. But what you can do is, instead of relying on your RFP responses to make the decision, you can look at, let's see it in action. Let's see the workflow, and let's let some of our business users assess and quantify and rate and compare the capabilities in these different areas. So that's the way you've got to look at it. It's a gray area. It's not a yes, no, can the software do it? It's where in the gray area on that spectrum are we, and which one is going to be the best fit overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's super interesting. I want to switch gears though and get into our next newsworthy article, which is about IBM. So this article covers how IBM is introducing a new flash system storage portfolio powered by what it calls agentic AI. The goal is to move enterprise storage from reactive infrastructure management to autonomous, self-optimizing systems that can predict issues, adapt performance, and reduce operational overhead. According to this article, enterprise storage environments are becoming more complex as data volumes grow, AI workloads increase, and uptime expectations tighten. IBM's new flash system portfolio embeds AI agents that can autonomously monitor system health, optimize performance, predict failures, and automate remediation without constant human intervention. The system is designed to improve resiliency, reduce downtime, and lower total cost of ownership by minimizing manual tuning and firefighting. IBM is also positioning these capabilities as critical infrastructure for AI-driven enterprises where data availability and performance directly impact business outcomes. The overall takeaway from this article is IBM is pushing infrastructure further towards autonomy, signaling a shift away from storage as a passive asset to storage as intelligent, self-managing platform. This reflects a broader industry trend toward agent-based systems that make decisions independently rather than relying solely on centralized monitoring and human response. So this is something I haven't heard about and I thought was super interesting. So I wanted to get your take on it, Eric. First of all, how autonomous is autonomous in real enterprise environments today? It's a lot of autonomous in that.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of it yet. I see the potential for it, but I don't see a lot of actual autonomy. What's fascinating about what you're talking about, though, is I would love to see someone prove that autonomous approach with agentic AI and infrastructure is going to reduce downtime or disruptions to IT operations. Before you can really scale it across to multiple customers and expect multiple environments to be using this autonomous agentic AI tool set, I would think you want to see what are the results? I mean, how is this actually affecting uptime and resiliency and the stuff you mentioned? And I just don't know. Yeah, because I know there's still issues with AI. It's not perfect. It still has its delusions and its weaknesses, or not delusions. I always say delusions instead of hallucinations. Two very different things. AI can be delusional, but what they typically say is it hallucinates. And so it makes mistakes. And so, at what point do you feel comfortable backing humans out of the equation more than they already are? So I don't know. I'm skeptical in the short term, but I would be optimistic the long term that could be a good solution. I just would be curious to see how do you navigate that in the short term while this technology is so young and so immature and there's so much at stake, if it gets something wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree there. One question I kind of have with this is, does autonomous infrastructure meaningfully reduce costs, or does it just simply shift them?
I think it could reduce costs, especially when you consider the cost of the disruption itself that it's meant to avoid. So, when you have disruptions to your infrastructure, there's obviously a cost associated with that. And of course, you've got the human side of maintaining and manually doing some of the things that AI agents could potentially be doing. But again, I don't know, if we reduce human labor costs, but it comes at the expense of reduced reliability or higher stakes mistakes from AI agents, then I would question its value. But I would love to see a real business case, like not a sugar-coated one, but like a real business case of someone who objectively looks at, okay, I paid this much for this agentic autonomous AI solution. This is how it affected my infrastructure, and this is how, this is the cost benefit of that. Until I saw that, I just wouldn't know. But I'd say in the short term, probably not a ton of value there. And it actually goes back to a question that one of the previous audience questions from earlier in the episode, where they're asking about why would I go, invest all this time and money in a technology like AI when it's still emerging. and the value is still yet to play out. I'm kind of with that person on that. It's like, well, let's see how this plays out. Let's see a couple of use cases in actual real world business cases, not theoretical, but what actually happened. And then we can assess, does this make sense, and where would we optimize or fine tune that model?
Yeah, absolutely. And my last question I have with this, I know you kind of mentioned it in the first few questions here, but where should organizations draw the line between AI-driven automation and human control right now, at least?
I think you have to have both right now, just because it's so unproven. And again, there's so much at stake to rely solely on AI to manage these infrastructures. So I think having humans with AI is at least an answer in the short term. It might be the best long-term answer too, depending on how the use cases and the business cases prove out of actual usage of it. So I'd say you definitely need both for the time being. But then the question is that just going to drive up your costs and create more redundancy without much business value to show for it? Or is it actually going to lead us towards lower cost longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, super interesting, but I'm excited to get into the conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited for the conversation. We actually were planning to have a guest on the show, but he was unable to join as sort of a last minute scheduling conflict that was unexpected. But he will be back on the show at a future time. And that's Jeff Winter, who's an Industry 4.0 expert and thought leader in the space, pretty well known. He won't be on today. Unfortunately, he was planned to be, he won't be, but he'll be on in a few weeks. But we're still going to cover the topic at hand, which is Industry 4.0, what's new, what's hype, what's reality, what are the trends in manufacturing technology and Industry 4.0. So we're going to dive into all that. We're going to ask the audience to jump in a bit more than normal here. There'll be sort of a stand-in for the guests here today, but it'll be a great conversation. We're going to dive into that in a bit more detail, just to give you that objective view of what's happening within the manufacturing technology space. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave Phase Zero without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or a free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to episode number 261 of Transformation Ground Control. This is the tech agnostic podcast that covers everything related to strategy, people, process, and technology. My name is Eric Kimberling here at Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and Lander Talent, companies that provide consulting and staffing solutions for ERP, IT, AI, and overall digital transformation and initiatives. So if you'd like to chat more about your projects and some of the struggles you might be facing, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. So our next topic is an interesting one that I love talking about. It's near and dear to my heart because it's the industry that I grew up in and started my consulting career, and that is the manufacturing industry. We're going to talk about manufacturing technology, what some of the trends are, what some of the hype versus reality, where manufacturers are struggling, what they're doing well, what advice we have for people that are in manufacturing that are going through digital transformations. So let's jump into the conversation. One last thing before we really get going here with the audience questions is I have a resource I want to share with you that's related to this topic, and I'll pop it up here on the screen for you all. But this is our manufacturing digital transformation report. It's a report that we just recently published that dives into some of the trends that we're seeing in the manufacturing technology space. So I encourage you to download that. You can just scan the QR code, and I'll drop this link in the chat as well as soon as we're done broadcasting here. But this is a really good guide that dives into not only trends in the industry, but we talk about specific technologies, types of technologies, specific vendors that are providing a particularly compelling angle in the manufacturing space. I'd love to hear your thoughts once you've had a chance to look at that, but feel free to download that off of our website. You can just scan that QR code. And if you aren't able to scan the QR code and you want to download it now, just go to thirdstage-consulting.com. If you go to our resource center, you'll find it there as well, but you can also just scan the QR code to get there directly. So I'll leave that up there for a second as we get going here. But one thing I want to talk about, I asked the audience one question, and I'm going to sort of treat you guys, the audience, as my guest here today in some ways, because some of these are the questions that I was going to ask our guest, and I will ask him when he's back on the show here in a few weeks. But I am curious to hear, what manufacturing and industry 4.0 trends are you most excited about, and what do you think is the most overhyped, whether it be AI or supply chain solutions, analytics, whatever the case may be, Internet of Things, robotics. Are there certain things you think are the most exciting part of what's happening in the manufacturing tech space? And if so, what are they? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we can dive into that here today. So I'll take away this QR code, but you can always rewind the video and go back to get it. I'm just going to get it off the screen here, and I'll pop it up again here in a little bit as well, just so we can have room to pop up some of the questions that we get here today. This is another comment from YouTube. It's from Saliga Abrams, ERP functional consultant, helping companies move from legacy systems to process-based ERP systems, mainly working with small and medium enterprise manufacturing companies. So thanks for pointing out what you do. And that's a really interesting space. I love the mid-market too. I love manufacturing. I also love the mid-market because you're dealing typically with a lot of growth. You're starting to see some organizations mature and grow up and go through acquisitions and create global supply chains. And there's just getting into some of the complexity that a lot of larger manufacturers tend to have. So that's a really interesting space. And thanks for sharing your perspective here. What I thought we could do is, talk a little bit, I talk a lot on the show about ERP systems and specific technologies that manufacturers can implement, or any organization can implement to improve their businesses. We talk a lot about the traditional ERP vendors like SAP and Oracle, who both have a lot of manufacturing clients, especially SAP, ECC and S/4HANA types of deployments are heavily in the manufacturing space, especially for larger manufacturing. You also have, some of the next tier of ERP providers like Microsoft Dynamics that has some manufacturing capabilities. And then you have others like Infor and Epicor that focus heavily on manufacturing. And I think there's some really interesting, I don't want to call them up and coming necessarily, because that makes it sound like they haven't been around for a while, but they are emerging technologies, I guess you could say, that are established. They're robust solutions. They're focused on manufacturing, and they are gaining a lot of ground and a lot of traction in the manufacturing space. So when I talk about these sorts of vendors, these are some of the vendors you might not have heard of, but ones that are doing particularly well in the space. One in particular is, for example, Acumatica. That's a cloud-based solution that has only been around for 15 to 20 years now. Not brand new, but relatively speaking, when you compare their technology or their companies to some of the more established incumbents like SAP and Oracle, who've been around since the that's a newer type of solution that is doing really well in the manufacturing space, especially with small and mid-size manufacturers. And so you have this new generation of manufacturing technology providers that are, in my opinion, taking some market share away from the established incumbent ERP vendors that also focus on the manufacturing space. Another example would be QAD. QAD is an ERP solution that's been around for, I believe, like 30 years. It's been around for a long time, focused almost solely on the manufacturing space, very heavy in automotive, food manufacturing, and some other areas. But they've made a really interesting overhaul of their tech stack and just their overall strategy, still focused on manufacturing, still focused on what they've always focused on in that they're building technology for manufacturers. But what's different with QAD now is that they're providing more of a native AI solution and more solutions built for frontline workers. So rather than just focusing on back office types of stuff that a lot of ERP vendors tend to be really heavy in, like, for example, if you look at some of the big tier one providers, they're pretty solid when it comes to the back office stuff like financials and inventory management, even, your basic supply chain type of stuff. But they haven't always been very user friendly from a shop floor perspective. And this is where we sort of cross over from ERP into manufacturing execution systems or MES systems. And companies like QAD, as an example, is one that is focusing more heavily on frontline workers and making their jobs easier and providing technologies that are easier and simplified, not overly complex or cumbersome like a lot of the bigger ERP systems. And so QAD is another example. And by the way, Third Stage Consulting is not affiliated with any of these software vendors. I'm just speaking from an objective perspective here of what we're seeing some of our clients implement. But QAD is a really interesting technology that I'll be curious to keep an eye on them and see where they go in the manufacturing technology space, because I think they've sort of bridged the gap between your traditional ERP functionality or ERP focus and combined it or sort of they're walking in this gray area now of moving more towards MES and shop floor automation that a lot of ERP providers that are out there now can't really provide solid solutions for without some sort of MES bolt-on or shop floor automation bolt-on to go with it. So very, very interesting trends that we're seeing in the space there. So I mentioned Acumatica, QAD. You've got obviously the big three with SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft. And then of course you've got all the other MES providers that are out there that are providing very, very solid solutions. And that's another area to think about as well. And these are just software solutions we're talking about, or traditional ERP systems, I guess you could say. But then you also have other technologies like AI. Obviously, is a big trend, a big buzzword right now. And then if you look at on the MES side, as I was alluding to, some ERP vendors, like I said, I mentioned QAD has some sort of MES-ish capabilities, but then there's other providers out there like Infor, even Oracle NetSuite provides some manufacturing MES type of capabilities. Pretty light, I'd say, not going to be scalable for a large complex manufacturer, but they do have some capabilities there, especially if you look in their partner ecosystem of third-party versions or third-party applications that have been built on the Oracle NetSuite platform. You can find some systems out there that provide more robust supply chain management and manufacturing types of solutions. Epicor has an MES system. Plex Systems is another one that I think we talk about them in the manufacturing distribution report as well. A lot of these systems that I'm mentioning, you can read about in that report that I mentioned here, and I'll pop it up on the screen here in just a moment, so you can download that as well. And then there's also companies like VAI Software is another one that provides pretty robust manufacturing capabilities. And I could go on and on. There's Aptian, there's others as well. And there's kind of a convergence now where you've got ERP providers that are trying to provide manufacturing capabilities, but they can't be everything to everyone. So they tend to have some deficiencies or gaps, generally speaking, in their MES and manufacturing capabilities. And then you've got these other niche providers that maybe provide really deep manufacturing solutions. They may not be as good at the financial reporting and the consolidation and some of the back office traditional corporate type of stuff. And so that's the big trade-off that manufacturers have to make is, do we take it the sort of best of breed composable approach where we find different pieces of software that can work best for our manufacturing organization, or do we just accept the fact that we're not going to get everything we want out of one platform and accept the capabilities and limitations that are there? And that's what we see a lot of times with, for example, SAP. A lot of companies, I'll pick on both SAP, S4HANA, and Oracle Fusion here because they both have the same problem, in my opinion, is they're relatively new or newer solutions within each of those vendor communities. And they just haven't had the time or the R&D dollars to yet catch up to what their legacy versions of the software had in terms of manufacturing depth and capabilities, especially when you get into things like you get into advanced planning and some of the more complex engineer to order manufacturing needs or workflows that an organization has. A lot of times SAP, S4HANA, Oracle Fusion don't have the depth that Oracle EBS or SAP ECC once had. And so on one hand, some of these incumbents or these larger ERP vendors that have been around for a long time, since back in the on-premise days, on one hand, they're creating these newer solutions that have more advanced capabilities in some ways, like with the AI stuff, the agentic AI, the analytics, some of the general automation and RPA and stuff like that. But on the other hand, they're missing some of the functionality that they had in terms of depth and detailed workflows and exceptions and things that could really enable different types of manufacturing organizations. And this is especially true. And this is something that's a big deal, I think, for manufacturers, especially. It's a big deal for all industries, but I'd say probably manufacturing more than any. And this is more of a call it a warning sign trend more than anything. But that is that, these cloud solutions and this big push to the cloud where SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, all these guys are pushing hard to get as many of their customers as possible onto cloud and ideally in many cases public cloud or multi-tenant cloud solutions like SaaS solutions. With that comes less flexibility than what manufacturers had with their on-premise systems. And it's not good or bad. I'm not here to say cloud is good or bad. I'm not here to say on-premise is good or bad, but that is a trade-off that we're seeing a lot of manufacturers struggle with right now, which is how do we get the capabilities we need? How do we take advantage of some of the new technologies that are out there, the new processes and workflows that are enabled by these new technologies? And how do we ensure that we're not hamstrung or limiting ourselves, limiting our options in the future? So those are all important things that we need to have at the top of our minds as well. And that's the big trade-off. The big $1 million question is, how do we navigate that? How do we move towards this future-proof concept, which, by the way, it's a cringy word for me. It's a trigger for me, but I'll still use it anyway, just because the industry loves to talk about it. How do we future-proof our manufacturing operations, even though there's no such thing? But how do we get more technologically advanced without creating limitations to our operations? Because I think right now in manufacturing, we're seeing a big conflict between manufacturing needs and complexities and diverse sets of operations versus the standardized vanilla approach that software vendors are pushing. Because if you think about it, software vendors are going to gain and benefit and be able to scale their solutions much better if everyone conforms to a standard set of processes, a standard set of workflows, a standard set of capabilities. The more complex and more diverse the organizations are out there, the more it sort of breaks their model or makes it more difficult to scale their solutions, because now you've got more workflows, more complexity, more things you've got to manage. And the reality of manufacturing, though, is that no two manufacturers that I've ever seen operate similarly enough that they could be using the same solution off the shelf out of the box without any sort of material changes or customization to the software. So that's the big problem I think manufacturers have. And I think manufacturers, more than any other industry, need to really take ownership of their transformation and think long, hard, strategically, and deliberately about what exactly they're committing to long term. Because the decisions you make today, the contracts you sign today, the implementation you commit to today is not only going to affect you in the short term in terms of risk, time, cost, resources, et cetera, and also in terms of operational disruption if the go live doesn't go well, but maybe even more importantly, it's going to affect you long term. So you're getting into a situation where in these cloud contracts, you're more locked in than ever. You're more committed than ever to these software vendors, and switching or moving away from them in the future is going to be more difficult than ever. And we have yet to see that big wave of manufacturers who have outgrown their cloud solutions try to now move to a new cloud solution that better fits their needs as they grow and evolve. And that day is coming. I don't know when it'll be. Probably we're still probably 5, 10, 15 years away from that first wave of manufacturers that say, hey, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this system was a good fit. It worked well for us for a certain amount of time. Now the technology has gone up one direction, our business has gone another direction, and we've outgrown the software. And now there's this delta or this gap and this tension between what we have versus what we need. And they're going to have to replace those cloud systems. And when that day comes, it's going to be really difficult for a lot of these companies to switch. So it's inevitable. It's going to happen. I'm not saying that you need to predict the future and buy the solution that's going to prevent that in its entirety. But I think the more flexibility you can build into your model is the better. And that typically is going to entail more of a composable approach to where you don't have vendor lock-in with one single vendor. It does freak me out a little bit. It'll scare me a little bit to see a manufacturer that just doubles down on one vendor, goes all in on a cloud contract, long-term contract with escalating costs, and with no control over what that functionality turns into or how that functionality evolves. Because you think about it now, when you're in the cloud solution, the vendor doesn't need to ask your permission, or you don't necessarily need to approve an upgrade to the software. The upgrades are happening more frequently, and it's not necessarily going to align with what you need as a business. And it's not necessarily going to be something that's not disruptive to your business too. So that's the really big, tricky part of being in manufacturing, and especially against the backdrop of the tech space here today, is that there's a push in technology towards standardization, vanilla solutions, but manufacturers are becoming more complex, are becoming more global. Product customization and product, there's a better word that I'm blanking out on right now, personalization of products. That's the trend in manufacturing. Manufacturing in general, from what we're seeing, is not moving towards a more vanilla world where more manufacturers are just operating more like one another. If anything, they're diverging and they're operating differently. And that's a natural phenomena. I think that's healthy phenomena. It's a free market, and there's global economies and global organizations that are going to evolve and try to create their own competitive advantages. And they're not going to be able to do that by using standard vanilla software. And I think that's the promise, that's the flawed promise that software vendors offer you when they say you're going to future-proof your business, you're going to get rid of your technical debt. What they don't share is that you're actually, in some ways, creating more problems and complexity and cost longer term. And so having a real deliberate strategy behind you to move into the future, knowing that you can't just sit still, you can't just sit on your legacy system forever, but doing things on your timeline, doing things that fit your needs, not a vendor's needs necessarily. Those are all important. And that's how we help our clients, by providing that objective client side, client facing advisory, trusted advisor role. So I want to get to a couple audience questions here. Craig on LinkedIn says ISA 95 is still a useful framework for parsing out who's who and what's in IT or operations technology. Even with AI, I'm closely following the MCP server and unified namespace concepts, which I believe help with plug and play. And that unified namespace is really interesting, that unified namespace concept, because anything that gives you more flexibility, more openness, more opportunities for integration, I think is generally a good thing. And if you look at what some vendors are doing, and I'll pick on SAP because they make it so easy to pick on them as a product and as a company. If you look at SAP, they're doing the opposite. They're trying to get as much of a footprint established within organizations, which is their prerogative. I mean, that's their business model, and that's fine. I'm not faulting them for pursuing their own profitability and profit motives. But I think a lot of times what buyers don't realize, especially from manufacturing organizations that don't have super sophisticated or super knowledgeable IT staff that understand both business and technology, a lot of those decision makers don't realize that when you move towards a closed ecosystem or a vendor lock situation, you're actually limiting your options, and unified namespace sort of runs counter to that. And I think that's a good option, or a good framework or methodology for how manufacturers can counter that. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. It's not the only way, I know there's some unified namespace purists out there, and people, they're zealots or just super passionate about that particular concept. And I'm not here to, again, I don't have a dog in that fight, but the dog I do have a fight in is the fact that whatever's best for a client, whatever they need, whatever fits their strategy and where they're going and their operations. I think that's the key thing there. So thank you for your comment there, Craig. And then another comment here from Nital on LinkedIn. Nital says, what do you suggest for a factory with legacy systems? How do they do IT, OT integration? Well, we talked about unified namespaces being one potential option, but I think if you back up and sort of zoom out for a second and look at what your options are, you do have the opportunity to create not only solutions that are open and able to integrate with other solutions, but you also have this movement towards integration and platform as a service tools. So iPaaS is what is referred to, IPaaS, and sort of like SaaS, but it's platform as a service instead of software as a service. And these platforms, this movement towards not just providing applications, but general platforms that are more flexible, that is a huge movement that I think is going to get a lot of traction. And I think especially in manufacturing, it's a really good thing for manufacturers. And there's the good thing with it too, is there's no one solution that provides these platform as a service options. You've got Boomi and MuleSoft are two of the better known ones that provide these integration tool sets that allow you to create workflows across different platforms or different applications, I should say. And this is a great way to handle both short-term, interim term, and long-term. It's a great way to handle the integration from legacy systems to new systems as you roll them out. So for example, if you decide you're going to roll out a new MES system or a new shop floor automation type of technology, but you're still using a legacy back office finance system or inventory management system, iPaaS tools can allow you to integrate those solutions without forcing you to do a big bang implementation of all new technology in order to get that integration, which is, the big risk that manufacturers face when they do decide they want to do a big bang approach where they try to implement everything as fast as possible. This allows you to take a more incremental, measured approach to where you could say, okay, for the next 2 to 3 years, let's just say, I'm going to continue to use this back office legacy system. Eventually, I'm going to replace it. But in the meantime, I can get value from that integration without spending a ton of time and money on a full-blown implementation in the short term. I can just implement my MES system, my new MES system, use a platform as a service tool set to integrate it back to my legacy finance system and any other systems I might need to, my old CRM system or whatever the case may be, my WMS, my warehouse management system, my supply chain solutions, whatever. It allows you to connect these different systems in a way that can be difficult if you go with more of an ERP-centric approach, which is ERP is the center of the universe, and now I've got to figure out if and how I possibly could connect things back to the ERP. Platform as a service moves that center of gravity away from ERP and more towards a central integration point, if that makes sense, to where you're now saying it's not just about ERP or it's not just about MES, it's not just about WMS or supply chain management systems. It's now about the overall platform and the way I can integrate. So you've got these integration, these platform as a service tools. In addition, you also have, I'd call them more hybrid solutions that are application providers that are also providing an open platform. And just to give you an example, probably the best known example I could think of in the manufacturing ERP space is Rootstock. If you've ever heard of Rootstock, it's a company that built a manufacturing ERP solution for mid-market manufacturers, but it's built on the Salesforce platform. So people think of Salesforce, they don't think manufacturing typically. But Salesforce is not just a CRM tool. It's actually an entire platform, an AI-driven platform that has third-party developers that have built applications, third-party applications that are all part of that same platform that integrate back to Salesforce and the other applications on that platform. That can be another nice way. If you're already a Salesforce shop, for example, it might make a lot of sense to consider, well, what if I were to find a product like a Rootstock or other third-party solutions on the Salesforce platform that allow me to provide, without having to bring in a whole new platform to the table. I can use that same platform to extend it into my manufacturing operations. That's just one example. Even NetSuite, I mentioned them before. NetSuite has a really interesting strategy because they're a legacy multi-tenant software as a service cloud product, right? They've never had the model of highly customized on-premise systems, which when they started the company back in 1998, I think that's a liability they had. I think it made it a little bit more difficult for them to get traction, although they didn't have trouble getting traction. But I think it was more of they were going against the grain back in 1998 when they started by providing this cloud-only, SaaS-only solution, because back in 98, early 2000s, people were so used to on-prem customized solutions. But now they've continued with that model, but they've also, in addition to having that multi-tenant cloud SaaS-based offering, they now have done something like similar to what Salesforce has done, where they've opened up the platform to third-party developers and ISVs and OEMs that can create solutions that are bolt-on, kind of bolt-ons or extensions of the core NetSuite capabilities. So there's a couple different companies out there. There's a company out there called PCG, for example, that has a product called Smart Factory, and it's built on the NetSuite platform. It's a Smart Factory solution on the NetSuite platform. So if you're already a NetSuite user, you're thinking about NetSuite for your financials and some of your basic inventory management, stuff like that, you could then look at something like a Smart Factory extension or an application within the NetSuite platform to extend that capability into more deeper manufacturing and smart manufacturing, Industry 4.0 types of capabilities. So there's a lot of different ways you can handle integration. You can do it the old school way of just buy a core ERP system and then figure out how you're going to integrate it back to your legacy systems that you need to keep in the short term or long term. Or you can go with a platform solution, or you can go with more of a best of breed option where you just go out and find different pieces of what you need, and then you tie those back to your legacy systems. And then there's a hybrid too, where it's sort of a combination of all of the above. So we see all these different angles with our different clients in the manufacturing space, and so there really are a lot of good options out there. We're talking here today about manufacturing technology trends, the Industry 4.0 reality check. Manufacturing technology is what we're talking about. If you missed it before, I wanted to share with you the new manufacturing digital transformation report that you can download from our website. You can scan this QR code that you see on the screen in front of you. I'll drop it in the chat as soon as we're done with the episode here today. And you can find that a lot of good information about trends, independent software reviews and rankings, just other things you need to know from a manufacturing technology perspective. So be sure to check that out. You can scan that QR code right in front of you there. So just getting back to some of the comments here. Garrett on YouTube says, I've quietly built an ERP scale AI business operating system, a zero human platform with 8 to 12 interconnected systems, including governance, orchestration, data monetization, live billing, trading, blockchain, and VFAS. So interesting point. Thank you for sharing that. Here's another comment from YouTube. Excellent point. The technologies are just as good as the frontline staff that use them. Most of the staff working in manufacturing are not consultants. One big challenge is staff training. That's a great point, because one of the big problems with manufacturing technologies is a lot of times they're built more for the office workers, the people that are trying to do demand planning or production planning, stuff that needs to get done. It's important stuff. But, manufacturing technology is not just about, running an MRP or reconciling inventory or understanding real time work in progress, things like that. That's all important stuff, but it's not all there is in it. You could argue that's not nearly as important as what the frontline workers do and how they affect the workflows and how they capture data and how they make decisions and how they're enabling more efficient ways of operating. So I think that's what you've got to look at is, you want to look at those back office capabilities that a traditional ERP vendor would provide, but you also want to look at, what about shop floor automation and MES type of stuff, stuff that interacts with and integrates with and captures data and provides decision-making capabilities at the frontline level. How can we get that? And so I think that's an important thing to consider as you define your digital strategy and look at your overall technology stack, your manufacturing technology stack, is how do I make sure I address all of those needs? And the last point is a really important one in that the big challenge is staff training. It's unfortunately, shop floor workers oftentimes get shafted, the short end of the stick when it comes to adoption and training and things of that nature, because the people running the implementation are typically back office workers, and they are thinking myopically about their world and their peers' worlds, and they're not necessarily thinking about how it affects the people that do the real work, the people on the front lines. And they don't necessarily think about how can we get them trained, to get them comfortable with technology, how can we upskill them to become a more modern manufacturing tech-driven organization. And so that's a great point. The staff training is always important, but I'd say in manufacturing, it's even more challenging and arguably even more important than most other industries. It's different when you're, an engineering-based manufacturing organization. You've got a bunch of people with master's degrees or PhDs in the back office that are engineers. Getting them to adapt to software has its own challenges, because sometimes the super educated people can actually be more difficult to train or change, but they at least understand technology. They're maybe a little bit more mature or advanced in their understanding of enterprise technologies. It's not the same when you're trying to get frontline workers who might have more of a skills training or more of a technical training versus a traditional series of college degrees. So you just have to know your audience and know how you're going to train them and how you're going to enable the user adoption based on whatever part of the organization that they're working in. We're here chatting about Industry 4.0 and manufacturing technology. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
When the soul of the city was laid to rest, and the night's forgotten.
If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book, and it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons that could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 261. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and Lander Talent. So if you'd like to learn more about how we can help with your consulting and or staffing needs with your digital transformation or IT initiatives, feel free to reach out to us. I've included my contact information below. And this show is produced by Major Tom Productions. If you'd like to learn more about how to collaborate with us, to get your message or your brand out to more people, feel free to reach out to Major Tom Productions. I've included contact information below. And we're here today talking in today's discussion about manufacturing technology, Industry 4.0, and everything else that manufacturing leaders need to know about digital transformation. Here's a really interesting question. I've been hearing this question more and more in manufacturing, and I love this thread here. This is from Sally Abrams on YouTube. Says, how can we address an environment where we have 3 to 4 different generations working, boomers, Gen X, Gen Z, more about the human aspects, work perspective, and work environment? First of all, I love this question because you're not asking anything about technology. And I think, to start with something like this is very smart. It's very on point, because you've got to think about, when I'm deploying technology or process changes, how does it affect people, and how and will my people actually be able to adapt to these new ways of working? It's one thing to see a sales demo and say, okay, cool. This does everything I needed to do on the shop floor. It meets all my requirements. I can check it off my list, on my RFP list, and my demo script list or whatever. That's one thing. But to then think about, well, what about the culture and the skills and the behavioral aspects of my organization, whether it's generational? I'd say it's not just generational, although that is a big thing, the boomer versus Gen X versus Gen Z. I'd say the Gen X, being that I'm Gen X, I'd say that they're probably the easiest ones to train because they're the most open to change. But that's what everyone thinks, right? Their generation is fine. They're fine, but it's the other people that are the problem. But I'd say not only is it generational, but it's also cultural too. Just general cultural. I mean, what part of the world are you operating in? Are you in a, even something as simple as, are you in an urban area where people are just maybe a little bit more technically just used to technology and speed? Or are you in a rural area? Are you, I think tenure is really important too. Someone who's been with your company for a long time, on one hand, is going to have a lot of really good, valuable tribal knowledge. But on the other hand, it might be more difficult for them to move past the way things have been. And they may not know anything other than the way things have been. And that's not a knock on them. It's just because they're loyal, committed, they've stayed with a job for years or decades. They're not going to be as knowledgeable and understanding of options that might be out there, better ways of doing things or whatever. And so, on one hand, you have to respect the fact that they know so much about your operations. They know where the bones are buried, how things work, all that good stuff. They may not necessarily know, though, the why. Why do we do things the way we do them? I think that's the hard thing when you're talking about more about tenure. I think the understanding why do we do things the way we do, a lot of times that's harder for people with tenure to answer. And sometimes even newer employees have trouble with it too, because they get hired, they get trained to do things a certain way. It gets ingrained in their daily workflows. And then we as consultants will come in and start to analyze the workflows and the operations, try to understand, how are you operating today? How should you be operating in the future? Where are the bottlenecks and pain points, opportunities for improvement, all that stuff that consultants look at. When we come in, a lot of times the big question we ask is why. Okay, you told us how and what you're doing, but why are you doing it that way? And, you don't want to, I don't say that in a way of like just challenging, like that sounds stupid. Why in the hell would you do that? That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am suggesting is just trying to understand the why. Like, what is it that drives that process? And a lot of times there's a really good, valid reason. A lot of times it's, hey, 80% of our revenue comes from this type of customer, and this type of customer demands certain requirements or certain things that affect our workflow. That I would say is a very justifiable why. But sometimes it gets a little dicey when people say, first of all, I don't know why we do it that way. It's just the way we've always done it. It's the way I got trained to do it. I got reprimanded when I didn't do it that way. So I've just learned that I have to do it that way. I couldn't tell you why, though. That's a tricky one, because then you think, okay, well, does anyone know why? Do we really need to do this? And so you start digging into that to get the answer. The other thing a lot of times you have to look at is, are we getting too caught up on the exceptions? Because a lot of times entire workflows are built around that occasional exception that throws sand in the engine of the entire operations, just because you might have this occasional situation that necessitates extra steps in the process or whatever the case may be, but then it ends up slowing down every other process that doesn't involve that exception. So that's the other thing you've got to look at too. So I know I'm getting well outside the scope of generational stuff, but I think you have to look at culture. You have to look at the history of the organization. You have to look at the pain of the organization. You also have to look at what the organization is doing well. That's a really overlooked one. It's so simple, but it gets overlooked more than you probably think. In this day and age where technology is up on a mantle because it's so cool and it's so advanced and it's doing so much cool stuff that we couldn't even fathom 5 years ago. We sort of have bowed down to the technology gods and sort of deferred to what technology does without necessarily taking a step back to say, well, hold on. Yeah, some of these processes were starting to emerge 100 years ago within our operations if we've been around that long. And there are some things that you do that are probably really important competitive advantages. And it's part of your secret sauce. It's how you scaled the company. It's how you became successful. It's how the founder, got the company going. And there's this mindset, it's almost like a condescending arrogance in the technology space that says, well, if you don't want to change that to adhere to our best practices and our software, then I don't know what to tell you because this technology is awesome, but you're stuck in the past. You're doing things the way you've been doing them for however long. Now, obviously, there's going to be plenty of things in any manufacturing organization that you can and should improve. I'm not saying the inefficiencies and the bottlenecks and the things that have always been there should always stay there just because they've always been there. I'm talking about the things that make you successful, and that's where I think manufacturers get hung up or tripped up a lot. Is they get almost gaslit into believing that they're the problem or they need to change their processes to adhere to the technology gods. And I would argue it should be the business leaders that are driving that. And sometimes the technology gods are right, sometimes they're not. But I think we have to stop being so dogmatic about just deferring to technology. And so I think that's an even bigger issue. Now, I don't even remember how I got into that topic because it has nothing to do with generational human aspects, but it is a really important one. So thank you for that question, Saliga. That's a great one. Another comment from YouTube: small and mid market is much more price sensitive to long term financial commitments. And if you are a smaller mid sized manufacturer, I would highly encourage you to model out a likely cost scenario of what's going to happen with your cloud costs over time. It's easy to get locked in at a relatively low cost, but there are so many escalation clauses in these cloud contracts. It's pretty crazy. A lot of times you have no control or visibility over it too. It could be driven by consumption, data consumption. It could be driven by number of users, number of modules, of course. It could be driven by number of AI agents that are deployed, number of reports, number of integration points. There's just so many ways that you can get nickel and dimed in these scenarios, but your original business case a lot of times doesn't consider those added costs or those escalating costs over time. The bad news with cloud solutions is there's no possible way that the costs will decrease. The good news with on-prem, even though it's outdated and a lot of organizations are moving away from on-premise to cloud, the good news with on-premise is once you paid for it, you paid for it. Yes, you're going to pay an ongoing maintenance fee. Yes, you're going to pay to support that system long-term, especially as the system ages. But that cost pales in comparison to the cost of a recurring annual subscription that repeats year after year and increases year after year with no definitive additional business value to go with that increased cost. So it really is shifting the power dynamic here away from customers, not just in the manufacturing space, but other industries as well. It's shifting the power dynamic away from customers, and the leverage is moving away from the customers to the vendors, because if you read these contracts, I mean, they could be, in some cases, there's no cap on how much the cost will escalate. They may lock you in for 2 or 3 years and put a cap on the potential cost increase. And by the way, when I say cost increase, I'm only talking about just what you commit to today. I'm talking about you implement these modules, these number of users, these capabilities, and that's it. Let's just assume you do nothing else. You don't buy any additional capabilities or start adding other AI agents or whatever, or even increase your consumption of data. I'm just talking, you're just using what you have and everything's status quo. They still have the right to raise the cost on that, in many cases arbitrarily. I know Microsoft had some controversy recently with Dynamics 365, where they had anywhere from 10 to 20% year over year increase on just the core subscription costs. And they did it because they could. The contract said they could. And there's a lot of customer blowback from that. And we did a couple articles and videos on that as well, and shared some of our experiences with clients. But, I think that's the vendor lock dynamic at play. And you just do have to recognize that when you commit to these cloud solutions, you are committing to a higher cost structure. You're moving dollars away from a depreciable asset. the CapEx cost versus now you're moving to an ongoing OpEx cost. So you're shifting things on the balance sheet, which could be good or bad depending on, your financial strategy and what your CFO thinks. But that's why, by the way, CFOs should be heavily involved in these decisions, because there is such a material impact, not only on risk during the implementation, the risk of operational disruption, the risk of budget overruns and things of that nature, but the long-term cost and risk is arguably just as important. So for those reasons, your CFO should be involved, especially if you are a smaller mid-sized organization. So great comments there. Darian has a great question on LinkedIn. She says, which manufacturing scenarios break first when organizations force standardized out-of-the-box cloud workflows? I couldn't give you specific workflows that are more commonly broken or likely to break, but what I can say is that it typically involves processes that are customer-driven, either customer or product-driven. So if it's something that is a configuration of a product for a customer requirement, that's usually a breaking point for a lot of these cloud solutions, because that's where you have more unique workflows and variations in your processes that are more prone to break a standard off-the-shelf cloud solution. So something that's customer driven in that way, or a product driven need. So when it comes, especially if you're an engineer to order or make to order manufacturer, you're more likely to see these cloud solutions get strained by the way that your product is built. Just to give you an example, we deal with all kinds of companies with different ways of tracking or different ways of building their products. I mean, you could have everything from commodity widget manufacturers, which are less likely to have a problem, by the way, if they're producing high volumes of the same things or very little variation in their products. And it's not make to order, it's more make to stock, and it's not a high variation in the manufacturing process. You're probably more likely to fit in pretty well to a cloud environment. In fact, I'd say you should, because it's a better fit. Cloud, vanilla systems, it probably simplifies things for you. It allows you to scale. You can do higher volumes, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the companies we work with are more complex than that. They're mostly make to order and or engineer to order manufacturing organizations that have pretty complex bills of materials and ways of producing the products, different complex supply chains, where they're sourcing materials from and how they get the raw materials to the shop floor and get the finished goods or the sub-assemblies into the warehouse, out to the customers, out to the other manufacturing locations, whatever. That's a very complex process that there's no one size fits all, yet cloud systems are trying to be one size fits all. So that's the big tension point there. So, we've had clients, for example, that'll have high dollar engineer to order products that are hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of dollar end product price tags to their customers. And the sub components are extremely valuable as well. And so, you have your normal bill of material hierarchy and routings and all that stuff that you build it within manufacturing. But a lot of those types of companies, for example, need serialized sub-assemblies or components. So they'll serialize it so they can track they can track those pieces. And in some cases, they're interchangeable, so they need to know where the exact part is within the supply chain. And that just will break some of these ERP systems, especially the cloud-based ones, because in some cases, they just haven't built that capability yet. In some cases, they have no plans to build that serialized bill of material hierarchy in that example. And that's just one example. I could give you a bunch of other ones, but that's one example of what you have to look at. And you have to have a mindset of looking at what is unique about us. What are the things that we do that's so different because our product's different, our customer's different. I'm not talking about the resistance to change types of difference. There is a resistance to change that goes with this, and you can't generalize it all. Usually it's two buckets. You've got resistance to change. People are doing things and want to do things a certain way, and they don't want to change just because they don't want to change. Set that aside for a minute, because that's a change management issue. And yes, in those cases, you probably should move to more of a standardized model where you can, or just adapt to the software the way it's built. I'm talking about the stuff that makes you who you are, and it's core to your operations. It's central to your manufacturing ops. It's central to your customer fulfillment, your customer satisfaction, and the reasons you win deals against your competitors. In those areas, that's where you're more likely to see those things break. And that's where you have to say, okay, let's really dive deep into these cloud solutions not just in a PowerPoint demo, but in an actual day in the life scenario of our operations. How would that look in that software? And would that work? Could that work for our business? And again, you have to just be prepared for the whole, the whole conversation that inevitably happens where your team comes to the realization that that workflow is not going to work for our operations. It might break our operations. You just have to be prepared for the sales message that goes with that. It'll turn it around on you. And it happens so often that it's nauseating at times. When I see it, it's a bit of a trigger, especially because we don't represent vendors. We're not partners with software vendors. We only partner with clients. So we are a bit biased, I guess you could say. You could call that biased if you'd like. So our perspective is always going to be from the client perspective. What does this client need and what's different about them? Now, we will push the clients to change where it makes sense. But what's maddening is when you get a sales rep that turns around and says, hey, actually, if you don't want to follow best practices, that means you're the problem. Do you want best practices? And of course, the simple answer is, of course, I want best practices. I want to be better. Then if you want best practices, then you need to just drop this whole thing that you're stuck on right now in this demo and just accept the fact that you can just, if you wanted to, you could adapt to these processes. And it sounds, as I'm saying it out loud, it's, a lot of you would probably hear that and say, well, of course we would never do that. But you'd be amazed at how often that happens in a real-time sales situation. And a lot of times executives especially will get convinced that that software is going to work just fine. And of course, all they've done now is punted the problem down the road. And it's going to take them a year or 2 or 3 to realize that was never going to work. And by then you've already spent tons of time and money on the project. The vendor, the technical implementers have already made their money. Now you're left with a big price tag on the implementation. And a lot of times, most of the time, that leads to a pretty significant operational disruption when you make those sorts of concessions. So that's all the stuff you've got to think about. I know I didn't give a series of specific examples, but that's a great question. And hopefully that gives you some sense of what to think about. Here's an interesting comment from Alafunke on LinkedIn. It's a pretty name. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. It's probably even prettier if I could pronounce it right, but I like that name. From my experience leading a similar effort at a semiconductor leader, you'd be surprised how blind companies can become to their IT and OT landscape. This is a very important phase 1 that gives you a critical tool to roadmap integrations. I call it risk-governed, CapEx smart transformation. Yeah, that's really interesting. The part about becoming blind to the IT and operations technology landscape. And you mentioned phase 1. I call it phase 0. We might be saying the same thing, but that initial planning stage where you lay out the blueprint of what your business processes are really going to look like, independent of technology. And yes, I mean, I shouldn't say independent of technology. You do need to talk about how technology is going to fit into it, but you're not there to start with the technology. I think most software vendors will say, we're going to start with what the technology does. We're going to tell you how your operations are going to work. You're going to tell us if there's something that won't work, and then we'll try to convince you that it actually will work. I mean, that's typically how the process goes. But what I think you're suggesting, and I would advocate as well, is you need to take that time before you get into the actual design and build of technology. You need to take the time to lay out your landscape of your business processes, and to your point, the IT and operations technology landscape. Because so many times companies don't think about all these edge systems that are doing different things, and they hadn't thought about how that's going to integrate. Will it integrate back to the core new technology that's being implemented? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to deploy it? All that good stuff. So really good point. I think the more you can spend time on that upfront planning piece to really understand your technical landscape, your operational landscape, and your organizational landscape too. That's another thing I haven't really touched on here much today, but plenty of other podcasts and videos I put out talk a lot about change management, but the human side of things is really important too, because especially now with AI in manufacturing, that's not just a technology lift or a process improvement lift. That's a material impact to people's jobs. And if you're running a union shop, you can't just go in and start changing people's jobs overnight. I mean, that's in some cases, AI can have a pretty material effect on how people do their jobs. In some cases, it might completely change the scope of their jobs, which again, if you're a union shop or you've got a labor board you've got to answer to, it's not going to be an easy change, regardless of what the technology can do. So those are all really important things to think about. So great point. So I would just broaden what you're saying here and say that you should look not only at the IT and OT landscape, but also your operations, your people, your culture, your organization, your leadership. How is that all going to be affected? What is this roadmap for our entire business, including technology, but not limited to technology? And I think too often we just focus on the technology. And even then, to your point, we miss a lot of things in the IT and OT landscape. So here's a good example, or a good question from Dimitri Ows on YouTube. It says another challenge for training is the turnover of frontline employees. Projects have to time training and continually cultivate the culture of learning. That's very true. And I would add to that too, you also would need to have repeatable, scalable training that plans for attrition. We have a client right now, actually not in the manufacturing space, it's a different industry, it's in healthcare, but we have a client right now where they run a bunch of health clinics throughout the world, and they have 80% turnover each year across all the clinics. And so that's a problem. They're trying to fix it, and we're working with them from more of a change and culture perspective to figure out why that is, to help shore that up. But in the meantime, as we're running the implementation and advising them on the implementation, we've been saying, you've got to plan as though that 80% is going to continue. And we've got to build this training in a way that isn't going to slow down or shut down operations if and when people leave. And it's a high turnover industry to begin with, the type of work they do. They could bring that attrition down quite a bit, but doesn't need to be 80%. But even if you're at 10, 20%, that can be very disruptive to a manufacturing operation. So you've got to think about not only what are you designing and building and deploying and training for today, but just as importantly, how are you creating something that's an asset and a repeatable, scalable approach to onboarding new people as they come into the operations, as you hire new people or as people leave the company. And too often you get through these massive price tag implementations. The implementation was a pain in the ass enough as it was disruptive. It affected operations. You finally stabilize everything. And after all that, you look up and say, now we have no documentation. There's no training documentation, or the training documentation sucks. It was built for a widget manufacturer, and we're building highly complex aerospace products. And the training materials we have is the generic off-the-shelf training from the vendor that talks about how to build a bicycle. Two very different things, obviously. And so that happens a lot. And so you've got to figure out, how can we build a training and adoption program, not only for the current employees, but going forward as well. And it's hard to do. I mean, it's easier for me to sit here and say you should do it when you're in the heat of battle and you're going through these implementations with all the time and resource and people being spread too thin, all that stuff. But it is something that, again, if you take the time to plan with a realistic timeline and a realistic budget, you can do these things. The problem is, so many manufacturing tech and software vendors in general sell you on this condensed, unrealistic timeline to where you end up cutting stuff, and you don't even have time to think about this, because you don't have time to get through the implementation itself, let alone think about what kind of documentation and training collateral will I have after the fact, and how can I ensure that people have this mindset of ongoing continual learning. Organizations too often are just operating in survival mode. They can't even think to that higher level yet, because they can't even get this project on time, on budget. So how in the hell can they find the time to think about the longer term, higher value type stuff like this? I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm just saying that's the dynamic that's at play, where organizations do overlook that more often than you'd like to see. Saliga on YouTube says, thank you for the excellent responses. Thank you for the excellent questions. Here's a question from Sanjay, somewhat related to what I was talking about before. This is from Sanjay on LinkedIn. Sanjay says, hello all. How do you overcome a single exception where the entire process is running? And how do you see the business aspect in scaling the organization? And I think this is in reference to, or in reaction to the comment I made earlier about how certain workflows end up becoming built in a very complex way because you're over considering exceptions, or you're building exceptions into the process when you don't necessarily need to. Let the exceptions have their bottlenecks and their disruptions, but isolate those disruptions and bottlenecks. Don't make it part of the day-to-day operations. And I think that's where you have to say, let's look at, the way our business operates 80% or more of the time. You shouldn't ignore the exceptions. And that's another pitfall that I advise you not to overcorrect and say, well, forget the exceptions. We're not going to worry about that, because then when they happen, it does disrupt the whole thing and it can bring your operations to its knees. You do have to think about it, but I wouldn't build the exception process into the core workflows. I would create a separate exception process of what happens when that exception happens and make it its own process that's different. Easier said than done, again, especially because so many of these cloud solutions are pushing towards standard, consistent, repeatable processes. It makes it harder to have variations. And that's the problem there too, is a lot of times because it's cloud standard vanilla software, the tendency is to want to build those exceptions in so that we have one set of processes, not one set of processes with 5 exceptions that might happen with different workflows, because that's harder to build and configure. It's expensive, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a trick. It's really tricky because you sometimes can spend too much time and money trying to manage those exceptions. But if you ignore them, then when they do happen in a go live environment, it really screws up your operations, especially if the exceptions are related to real high value customers or high concentrations of revenue that are part of the exception. It's a lot more art than science, I would say, on how to handle that. There's a lot of really good questions here. See who needs a guest anyway when I've got all these great questions coming from the audience here. But I will be curious to cover this topic again in a few weeks when we can get our guests back on here. Try to get to a couple other comments here. This is from Craig on LinkedIn. Craig says he's agreeing with Olafunke. The divide between IT and OT can be quite pronounced. Bringing them together is a very diplomatic endeavor. That's a very good point. This is from Antoine on YouTube. Says, have you had a situation where the manufacturer you were helping had great expertise in their products, but no capacity to implement the technology due to long tenured employees and limited talent pool? Yes, I have. It's like you read my mind. And I'm assuming you may have had the same thing as well, since you're asking the question. But yes, this is very common. I mean, think about it. Manufacturers are typically good at building stuff. They're good at building and designing products. They're good at logistics and supply chain, and they're good at grit. I'd say manufacturers are good at the gritty stuff. Technology can be gritty, but in a much different way. It's a different kind of grit. And no amount of grit can overcome some of the garbage that the technology industry creates for its customers, which is why I think a lot of what you've got to think about is, who are we really? I mean, how skilled is our team? If you have a team that has very little technology maturity or competency and you're using a really old legacy system, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I hate how the industry has a way of judging manufacturers for having old technology. It's not the end of the world. You're still running your business. You're still probably succeeding. Yes, you could improve. Yes, it's an opportunity to modernize your technology stack, but it doesn't make your people bad people or part of the problem because they've been using the same technology for 20 years. If anything, they should be commended that they've been able to scale the company the way they have with limited technologies, in some cases, crappy technologies. So rather than condemning them and judging them for the legacy processes, you've got to say, well, that's the reality of where we are, right? So we've got these systems and processes that we put in place 30 years ago. We've completely outgrown them. We know we need to change them, but also recognize you're not going to change that overnight. It's going to take you time to do it. And so when a vendor comes in and tries to sell you on this magical unicorn and rainbow driven utopia that is going to be an easy lift and shift of the technology, you have to take a step back and say, hold on, this is a huge jump for us. Maybe we're a really conservative organization. Maybe we're a family-owned, third-generation family-owned manufacturing shop. Maybe we operate in a rural, conservative part of the world, and maybe we're just not a fast-moving organization, and that's okay. Instead of trying to deny or instead of being in denial, why not just say, okay, that's who we are, so let's build a roadmap that makes sense for us. Let's create a digital strategy. Let's make a series of decisions that are realistic for us, that make sense for us, that isn't going to break the operations that we spent so many decades building, rather than trying to think that maybe if we just deny it and bow again to the technology gods and listen to the technology gods, maybe things will be different. We'll just be able to do a lift and shift and we'll magically be modernized. Everyone's going to be happy. Everyone's going to be so much smarter and technology driven. It's going to be awesome. You may want to get there. I'm saying don't aspire to that, but just know that's not going to happen in a year or 2 years. It's going to take a long time. So rather than denying it and listening too much to the sales messaging, why not just look at who you are as an operation and take a deliberate approach? If you know you've struggled with change in the past, your people are going to resist change, then don't force it. Don't force something that's not going to work. And so I think that's the key, is to really look at the reality of your tenure of your employees, the maturity and skill set of your employees. And when I say maturity, I don't mean do they act like children. I mean, do they know technology? Do they have experience in other organizations to know that there's other ways of operating? That's what I mean by maturity. If there's a limited talent pool, if you're in a part of the world where there's just not a lot of good resources or a lot of technology trained resources, that's okay. Just recognize it and know that we need to have a strategy to address that risk. And we should also build a strategy and plan that takes that all into account. So great questions. Really appreciate all the great comments and questions here today. A lot we didn't get to here today, but this is a topic we will definitely cover again in the near future. So not to fear, we'll have our guest on. Jeff, we'll have him on here again in a few weeks. Hopefully we'll have that announced here shortly on when that will be. In the meantime, and to leave you with this, here I'll pop up one more time, the Manufacturing Digital Transformation Report. This is a report we just published it a few months ago. We talk about different technologies in the manufacturing space. We talk about some of the trends in the manufacturing tech space and just ways to think about your manufacturing technology strategy from a objective perspective. It's not a sales pitch. It's not affiliated with any software providers. It's just an objective view, a manufacturer's based view of how you can objectively pursue your digital strategy and define a technology roadmap that makes sense for you. Well, thank you to the audience for great questions there. Hopefully you found that information useful, and we've got a lot more to cover. We're going to debrief on some of the conversation we just had here with Darian, and we're also going to get into why software best practices don't exist, and they never did. So we've got a lot more to cover in this episode. Be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. If you're leading a digital transformation or ERP initiative and you want to avoid the costly mistakes that most organizations make, that's where Third Stage Consulting comes in. We are an independent and technology advisory firm, meaning that we don't sell software, we don't take commissions from vendors. Our only job is to protect your interests and be on your side. We help executives and project teams plan, deliver, and recover digital transformations and ERP projects, reducing risk, improving adoption, and delivering real business value. If you want clarity before you commit to your digital strategy, or if something feels off track to you, feel free to reach out to us at thirdstage-consulting.com, and my team and I would be happy to help.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Sometimes all I think about is you. Late nights in the middle of June. He always been faking me out. Can't make you happier now. Sometimes all I think about is you.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 261. My name is Eric Kimberly, here with Darian Chwialkowski. And Darian, we just had a conversation about Industry 4.0, manufacturing technology, all kinds of technology stuff related to digital transformation in that industry. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I thought the audience had a lot of good questions. I wanted to follow up on a couple of them, though, and a couple of the topics with you, Eric, starting with where cloud ERP actually fits and where it can break. For, I guess, which manufacturing profiles truly benefit from standardized cloud ERP?
Yeah, I think the industries that truly benefit from standardized cloud ERP, one criteria is not industry based, but that would be one that is a smaller organization that perhaps hasn't been around as long. It might be a newer organization, maybe not a startup, but one that has not been around for 100 years or more, let's just say. The reason being is those organizations typically have less complexity. They typically have less organizational baggage and history, for better or for worse. And it's just easier for them to change and adapt to newer technologies. So a lot of times one criteria is if it's a younger or a newer company, they're more likely to adapt better to cloud solutions. But I'd say when you're talking about industry types, I'd say, think about more vanilla processes or vanilla industries. And no industry is truly vanilla. And I don't mean vanilla like boring or, they don't do anything well. I just mean they've got repeatable processes that aren't super complicated. So you think about even in manufacturing, as we were talking about just a moment ago, solely on manufacturing technologies, it's the high volume make to stock widget manufacturers that produce textiles or just high volumes of a low variation of SKUs or parts. That's just more conducive to a cloud environment because that's basic manufacturing, that's basic distribution. A lot of times distribution or retail are a little bit more open to cloud vanilla solutions. But I'd say where it's not a good fit is when you get into the more complex types of organizations, manufacturing, distribution, the really complex engineer to order manufacturers. Certainly when you get into government, financial services, aerospace and defense, food manufacturing with all of its regulations and variations in the ways that manufacturers make food products or food and beverage. So I'd say those are some of the areas where it's not a good fit, but I think it's a good question and one you should really start with when you're asking yourself, where do we fit? And I'm not saying if you're a complex organization or one of those organizations where it's not as likely to be a good fit that you shouldn't pursue cloud solutions, but it just means I'd be a lot more careful and I'd be a lot more deliberate and I'd be a lot less likely to go all in on cloud solutions. I might have more of a hybrid approach where maybe I keep some of my legacy on-prem systems, or maybe I do a little bit more build versus buy. Maybe I invest more in a platform versus a specific cloud-based apps. That gives me more flexibility. So really knowing where you're starting from and the reality of the backdrop will help guide you in the right direction so you don't end up going down a bunch of rabbit holes and evaluating options that really don't make sense for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great points there for sure. The other topic I wanted to dive back into was leadership judgment over technology. With this, Eric, why do leaders accept comforting narratives during a sales cycle?
Because it's what we want to hear. When you ask the question, is your system going to be hard to deploy? And they say, no, it's a lift and shift. We've got best practices. We've got industry pre-configurations. We've got implementation accelerators. We eliminate all your technical debt. They have a way of saying the things that we want to hear, and it sounds good. And if I don't know any better, it's what I want to hear, and I don't know any differently. So where do I sign? I mean, that's typically, I'm oversimplifying. Obviously, it doesn't always happen that way, but with a lot of leaders, especially people that haven't been through a big technology transformation recently, a lot of times they're the ones that are most at risk because they don't understand what they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what a great conversation today. Like I said, I love the questions from the audience, and I am excited for when we can get the guests back on as well.
Yeah, we'll have to have Jeff on here. Hopefully next month we'll have him on. But in the meantime, hopefully we've provided some good info there for an industry that's has a lot of need for technology guidance. So great conversation there. And again, thanks to the audience for bailing me out. It's always awkward when, especially when at last minute, when I don't know I'm not going to have a guest. I wasn't quite as prepared as I usually am. So it helped a ton that the audience had such good questions that kept my head in the game there. So thank you to that, or thank you for that. So we're going to shift gears here and talk about software best practices. For those of you that have been through the software evaluation and procurement process anytime in the last 10 or 15 or more years, you've probably heard this term that's called software best practices. And it's, in my opinion, probably, if I were to pick one, the number one most cringeworthy buzzword of the 2000s, it would probably be best practices, because it's arguably the most misleading term that sets the most unrealistic possible expectations for enterprise technology buyers. And the concept being that software best practices somehow will make your implementation easier. Somehow the technology will help you decide how to run your business, and technology will solve all your problems and become that magic silver bullet, easy button that you've been looking for all along. And again, it gets back to that psychological phenomena of it's exactly what I want to hear. I want to hear that the technology provider has best practices. I don't have to make the messy, tough decisions of how I'm going to run my business, because the technology solution will provide the answer for me. And I've got one way of operating now. I've got a common set of tools, and everything's going to be great. And we can all ride off into the sunset together. Unfortunately, it's a complete hoax. It's not true. It doesn't exist. There are technology best practices when it relates to cybersecurity and the way the software is built, but I'm talking about operational workflows, how you run your business day to day. There is no such thing as best practices. And so I made a video about this on my YouTube channel explaining what it is, why I think it's a hoax, or why I think they don't exist. And I'd love to hear your comments as well. What has your experience with best practices been? And I'd love to hear your comments as we're rolling the video here. But let's roll the video and we'll come back and talk about it as well. Let's first start by understanding what the term best practices mean. And there's essentially two types of best practices, and I'm going to focus on just one of the two types of best practices. The first type of best practice that I won't talk about here today because I think it's actually beneficial to the technology space is technology best practices. This would be things like we have cybersecurity best practices that are very effective in keeping hackers out of the system, or we have best practices around cloud deployment in terms of how a cloud infrastructure can deliver software as a service to a client. Those technology back-end best practices are real, and those are legitimate. The best practices that are not legitimate, that are actually harming companies, are the concept of business best practices or software best practices. And what I mean by this and what the industry means by it is, let's just say you're deploying a customer service sort of technology, a customer service module within a broader ERP system or a broader technology stack. It means that there's certain ways that that software is built to operate that may or may not be flexible to change, but the software vendor will try to convince you that it is considered best practice. In other words, what the software vendors would like you to believe is that they have somehow determined what best practice is, and that if you deploy their technology, you'll be better off than you are now. And by the way, if you resist any of those best practices, then you must be the problem, because why would you ever resist best practices? Because they're best practice, and if you don't agree that they're best practice, it must mean that you're resisting change. So there's a sort of reverse psychology or a gaslighting that goes on in that sales messaging, but it's something that's been prevalent in this space for decades now. Even when I started my career a long time ago, that was a common term, and it's just become more and more common in this industry over time. And the problem with best practices have been exacerbated by the fact that we now have cloud solutions that are a lot less flexible than technology was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, when we had on-premise versions of our software and we could make mass changes to that software for better or for worse. We had flexibility, we could change the software however we wanted, but now we don't have that same flexibility, so we need to blindly follow and assume that whatever vendor we've selected somehow has best practices that no one else has, including their competitors, including your competitors. Somehow this is best practice, and you're expected to believe that. Now, the reason this is such an appealing term is because it's what we all want to hear. We all want to hear that the software vendor or the software solution will tell us how to run our business better than we do today. In some cases it will, and in some cases these best practices are actually going to be a step back, and they're going to dilute a competitive advantage you might already have. Which leads me to the next point, which is, what are the problems with best practices, and why is this such a fallacy and an urban myth within the enterprise tech space that's so widely believed? Now let's talk about the reality of software best practices. And I want to back up for a second and just forget about technology and think about the concept best practices. Ask yourself this: do you think that there is an international governing board out there that knows your industry so well that they are the arbitrators of what best practice is? I would submit to you that the answer to that is no. Secondly, you have a whole host of different software vendors to choose from in the marketplace. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, yet they all tout this concept of best practices. So the question then is, who actually has the best practices amongst these different vendors you're talking to? If they all say they have best practices, does that mean the software is all the same? Of course not. So that leads one to believe that maybe best practices don't exist. We also hear this term best practice embedded in other selling points that we're hearing commonly in recent years, things like fit to standard. We're going to have our standard software, we're going to take that standard software, we're going to look at how your business can change to fit that software. And there's also a concept called clean core, which is don't customize anything, just use the software the way it was built, and everything will be fine. And then another term that's been around for a while that's similar to best practices is pre-configured industry solutions. This one is a little bit more real. This has a little bit more meat to it because they are pre-configured in many cases. In many cases, they have been pre-configured for an industry, but it still doesn't mean it's best practice. It's pre-configured, yes, it's pre-built, but it doesn't mean it's best for your industry or for you as an organization. So here's the bottom line reality of best practices. What best practices really are the way that a software company decided to build their software. They might think it's the best way to run the software. They might even have specific customers that they modeled in building that software, but it doesn't mean it's going to be best for you. Certain parts of your business, yes, best practices may be relevant. For example, your accounts payable process. That's a great example because it's something that you don't necessarily need to have a competitive advantage for in terms of paying vendors faster than your competitors. That does you no good. It doesn't give you a leg up or any sort of competitive advantage. And paying vendors is fairly straightforward, especially when you look at accounting standards around three-way match and other aspects of accounts payable workflows. So in that case, yes, maybe best practices are fine for accounts payable, but when you look at something around a complex manufacturer that has a very unique product, a very complex way of building a product, a very complex way of delivering a product to a customer, complexity is not always bad. That complexity oftentimes is the competitive advantage that you've created that your competitors can't replicate, which is another reason why I would submit to you that best practices don't exist, because if everyone had access to those same best practices, then I would say they're not best practices. They're just average practices or common practices, which means you don't have an advantage over your competitors. So that's the first step, is to understand what best practices really are. It's largely a sales and marketing message that sounds good in theory, but it's not something that fits reality. However, what I do want to talk about next is when best practices do make sense, when they don't make sense, and when they're not relevant to your organization. So here's a simple rule of thumb of when you should consider best practices and when you shouldn't. When you should consider best practices, or in other words, just the way the software vendor decided to build their software, it could be in your more vanilla commodity-based processes. Things like accounts payable, the way you set up your general ledger, chart of accounts, basic financial reporting, things like that. You don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel or be super unique or complex in the way you do those things. In those cases, what vendors tout as best practices are probably going to work fine for you, or at the very least, you're okay changing your business to fit the software. Where best practices are not a good fit and where they're completely irrelevant is in areas that are unique to you in terms of competitive advantage. And when I say unique to you, I don't mean unique to you in that you just refuse to change and that's the way you've always done it, but no one can seem to explain why that is. I'm talking about true, unique competitive advantage. This is your secret sauce. This is why customers hire you. This is why you're better than your competition in certain areas. Those areas, by definition, are not going to be available to you by using quote-unquote best practices off the shelf for a standard vanilla cloud software solution. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do about those things? Do we just go find a different vendor? Do we try to customize the software anyway? It's a good question. I'm going to come back to that in the next section of this video. So we've talked about when best practices are relevant to your business and when they're not. What do we do when we've come across an area or areas of our business where best practices are not a good fit for the software vendor that we're looking at? Well, the first option is you may want to look at other system providers. It may be that the software vendor you're looking at isn't a good fit for you. You should consider other ones. In some cases, it may be that parts of what that software vendor is offering to you may be a good fit, but you may not necessarily need to buy all the modules or all the solutions that they offer. You may want to focus just on buying the ones that best fit your business. And then you might want to go look at third-party bolt-on alternatives for those areas that are not a good fit for your business. This is why best-of-breed and composable ERP and interoperability models are becoming so popular right now. It's because companies are recognizing that they can still use standard off-the-shelf software, but they can pick and choose which pieces best fit for them, and they can create this sort of complete picture, complete puzzle that creates a unique competitive advantage without necessarily needing to customize or change the software that they buy. You don't necessarily need to go buy one software solution to run your entire business. It may mean that you have multiple solutions to manage different parts of your business. And the technology purists out there and the IT types watching this video right now might say, but Eric, that's a terrible idea because now you've got multiple systems you've got to manage. Now you've got to integrate those systems. It's a lot of complexity from a technical perspective. And yes, that's true, but it may be that those costs and risks are much lower than the cost and risk of not having technology that fits your business. And then the third option you have when you come across a situation where the technology doesn't fit your business. And this would be your last resort, I would say, but not a terrible last resort, but maybe it's your third priority. And that would be to custom develop the solution that you need. You might need to find different parts of your business that are so unique to you that you don't want to water it down at all. And you may need to create a custom solution to handle those parts of your business. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean creating a whole new solution from scratch. The good news is that there's a lot of platforms as a service, or PaaS solutions, that give you a platform, a common platform, and a common tool set to create different types of solutions. Even some standard off-the-shelf software providers like Salesforce, NetSuite, Microsoft, and others provide development solutions that augment their core off-the-shelf software to give you flexibility to get the best of both worlds. So that's another option, is you can develop solutions and capabilities that may not be available off the shelf. But I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts around best practices? Have you seen them work? Have you run into trouble with those best practices? Has it created complexities for your digital transformation? I'd love to hear your thoughts below in the comments. So Darian, that was our video from my YouTube channel where I talk about software best practices and how they don't exist. What was your knee-jerk reaction to that video?
Yeah, I thought it was a great video overall. I love how you said right away, best practices actually don't really exist. And I say this because, I mean, when you were talking about how what vendors call best practices are simply a way to make their software designed, not a universal proven way to run a business. I found that super interesting. And obviously best practice is a huge buzzword within every corporate space. So I think it's interesting to kind of break down what really that can mean. With that, how can leaders identify which processes truly create a competitive advantage, even if it doesn't fit in that best practice mold?
Well, I think, first of all, don't worry about whether or not it fits into the best practice mold. I'd worry more about the other part of your question, is it really a competitive advantage? And I say that, I'll play devil's advocate here. And I think what software vendors are trying to do with this concept of best practice is challenge their customers, right? And that's okay. I think you can challenge your customers to say, why do you do it that way? And do you really need to? I think that's a fair question to ask any business, any organization going through change, any organization that feels like the software isn't going to fit their business, or vice versa. The difference, though, is how you address the responses or the conclusions you get. If the answer is, I don't know, we've just always done it that way, or if you were to ask, do we need to do it that way? And you say, I don't know, I'm not sure. I just was trained to do it that way, but no one can seem to explain why they do it that way. Then that's the situation where you say, okay, I might be a little bit more open to just whatever the software can do. I'm probably going to be okay with it. And just to give you maybe an extreme example, if you think about accounts payable, or even just setting up a general ledger, those are very basic vanilla processes that don't have a lot of variation. There's some, but there's not as much variation in those processes across businesses within a given industry. And in many cases across industry too, there's not a lot of variation in some cases. So in those cases, you might say, okay, that is where, even though I don't like the word best practice, I will defer to what the vendor prefers to call its best practice. I can defer to that. But the other areas where it's like, no, 60% of our customers demand this, and that, and therefore we had to build this, and that into our workflow, then that's where I'd be a lot more resistant, if you will, to deferring to best practices. This is where I'd say, no, I need to define what best practices are for me, and only me. Potentially, I might be the only company in the world that's operating this way, but that's okay. That's intentional, and that's a good thing, because now it's going to be harder for other companies to replicate that. In that case, you'd say that I'm not going to fall for the best practice trap. I'm going to pursue a different route, and that different route could be customization. It could be a third-party bolt-on. It could be a manual workaround. It could be a completely custom solution. There's a lot of different ways you can address it. The problem is your software vendor will try to convince you not to do that, because they want you on their platform. They want to sell more software. They want to sell more services. So they're going to try to do everything possible to keep you on that solution. But you have to just look inwardly in that case and say, we are who we are, and we know what we want to be, and we know our business. We know our customers better than anyone. We know our own best practices better than a technology provider in those cases.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of stole my next question there a little bit, but I'll ask a different one anyways to wrap up today. What risks are executives overlooking with rigid cloud platforms?
I think the biggest risk they're overlooking is just the implementation time and cost is part A of the biggest risk, but actually part B of the biggest risk is what happens after go live. I don't recall the last time that a client willingly said, let's assess what the financial impact of a disruption would be if we don't get this right. Usually they're so focused on how do we go live on time, on budget? How do we minimize implementation cost? How do we stop the bleeding up front before the implementation? That oftentimes they make myopically short-term decisions that lead to longer-term cost and disruption. So that, if I had to pick one, I'd say the post-go live disruption cost and risk. What is that? Because that is usually pretty eye-opening. If you, for example, put some hypothetical scenarios in place, like what if I can't ship product for 2 weeks? What is that? What's the cost? Or if I can't close the books, if I miss payroll, if I can't run payroll correctly, I might have fines and pissed off employees. What's that going to cost me? So you have to look at those consequences and understand what that is and compare it to the consequences of if I go over my budget or spend too much time up front. And a lot of times that can put things in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what a great episode today. I feel like it all came together. Everything kind of meshed together on that.
Yeah, a lot of good topics here. So thanks for being part of it. As always, thank you to the audience for being here, and thanks for the great questions. New episodes every Tuesday or every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. Be sure to check it out. You can see all the past episodes there as well. You can also subscribe on whichever platform you like to listen or watch. At that same website, go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. If you'd like to chat about your project and how we can help from either a consulting or staffing perspective, feel free to reach out to me, even if you just want a sounding board for where you're headed with your project. I've included my contact information below. So I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.